I present the report of the Legal and Constitutional Affairs References Committee on Justice Reinvestment, together with the Hansard record of proceedings and documents presented to the committee, and move that the report be printed.
The question is that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Wright.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I seek leave to move a motion in relation to the report.
Is leave? You don't need leave, Senator Wright. You can just move that motion.
I move that the Senate take note of the report and would be pleased to speak about the report. Thank you. I'm pleased to speak about the findings of the Legal and Constitutional Affairs References Committee inquiry into the value of a justice reinvestment approach to criminal justice in Australia today, both as the chair of the committee and also as the legal affairs spokesperson for the Australian Greens and the initiator of the inquiry. The Senate referred this matter to the committee on the 26th of November last year. In moving for the inquiry, I was responding to very serious concerns throughout Australia about the growing rate of Indigenous incarceration and unsustainable spending on prisons in this country. It followed great concern amongst academics, social groups and from the Indigenous community in Australia. I'll talk more about the contributions of these groups later. I want to briefly explain the concept of justice reinvestment first. Justice reinvestment involves redirecting or reinvesting resources from prisons into programs and strategies that are proven to prevent crime from occurring in the first place. These programs and strategies are focused on the communities which have been identified as giving rise to the greatest concentration of offenders who end up in prison. And not surprisingly, these are communities where there is poverty and disadvantage. The results are less crime, safer communities and large financial savings. Win, win, win. It is an old idea with a new name, effectively, the idea that prevention is better than cure. But what is new is the new rigour that's brought to the process, with scrupulous data collection, analysis, consultation and evaluation. It's evidence-based policy, not just intuitive, and it has been proven to work. The justice reinvestment approach originated in the United States, which had a 700% increase in its prison population between 1970 and 2005. But despite the number of prisoners being locked away, people were not feeling safer. Budgets were blowing out. And in the end, it was the spiralling costs that focused the minds of decision-makers and helped convince both Democrats and Republicans, in a rare display of bipartisanship, to embrace the concept. Since then, there have been phenomenal results in many states in the United States, including Texas, which is hardly known for a warm and fuzzy approach to crime. Australian prison statistics may not be as bad as those in the United States, but they are still alarming. Over the last 30 years, the number of people in Australian prisons has tripled. Our prison population is growing well above the general population growth. Each year, our prisons across the nation cost us over $3 billion just in operating costs, let alone payroll and building expenses. Add to that the costs of government through welfare, health and other services, and the social costs borne by communities and families, and you can see that this is an immense challenge we cannot ignore. It is in Indigenous communities that the real costs of prisons are most keenly felt. On any one day in Australia, there will be almost 8,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in jail, at a rate of 14 times higher than the rest of the population. If this rate continues, the number of Indigenous adults in prison will double in just 12 years. And the situation is even worse amongst youth. Less than 5% of young Australian people are Indigenous, but in 2011 to 12, almost half of all young people in detention were of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. These figures reflect a total failure of public policy and are a national shame. Prisons, of course, will always be necessary for some, but for most offenders they are only a temporary solution to criminal behaviour. Most people leave prison and return to the very same communities from which they came, but often in an even more dysfunctional state than when they entered. 44% of those will then be back in prison within 2 years. This revolving door is unproductive and expensive. As one of my colleagues on the inquiry, Senator Humphries, observed, prisons are a failed institution. Given this context, there is a clear need for a new approach to crime and justice in Australia, and there is a broad political will for change. This inquiry received 131 submissions, overwhelmingly in favour of a justice reinvestment model. We heard from groups as diverse as the National Congress of Aboriginal's First Peoples, Red Cross Australia, the Australian Human Rights Commission and the Chief Magistrate in the Northern Territory. There were mental health, youth, legal advocacy and church groups also strongly represented. The inquiry has made a number of recommendations, but before going into detail on these, I'd like to bring the Senate's attention to some compelling evidence which gives an example of over-incarceration and the use of prisons as a first rather than a last resort. I refer to the testimony of Mr Peter Collins, Director of Legal Services of the Aboriginal Legal Service of Western Australia, which illustrates a culture of incarceration, particularly among Indigenous youth. Mr Collins told the committee, "In 2005 I appeared for a 16-year-old boy from a place called Onslow, who spent 12 days in custody for attempting to steal a $2.50 ice cream. In 2009 I appeared for a 12-year-old boy who had never been in trouble, who was charged with receiving a Freddo frog worth 70 cents. In 2010 I appeared for a 16-year-old boy with a serious intellectual disability who had never been in trouble. He was charged with receiving a soft toy. He spent 4 days in custody before he was released again by a magistrate. In 2011 we appeared for an Aboriginal girl from Roebourne in the Pilbara who was charged with trespass. She was found on the weekend playing in playground equipment in the local primary school. This year we've acted for an Aboriginal man from Perth who is homeless and a chronic alcoholic. He was charged with robbery involving a $1 packet of noodles taken from another homeless man. He, up until yesterday, had spent 3 months and 2 weeks on remand because he could not get bail. That was the testimony that we heard in Western Australia. The core theme of this inquiry's recommendations is for action at a federal level to change the trajectory of our justice system. To save money and create safer and stronger communities, the Commonwealth must take a leading role. We need excellent, reliable, comprehensive data to identify the at-risk communities where resources need to be directed. Huge gaps and inconsistencies in data were identified by many stakeholders. As such, we have specifically recommended that the Commonwealth, best placed to identify, coordinate and distribute nationally consistent data, consider establishing a Justice Reinvestment Clearinghouse to promote good data research and program evaluation. The committee acknowledges that it's states and territories who have primary responsibility for criminal justice, but increasing incarceration rates are occurring in all jurisdictions. And as such, the committee is of the view that there is a benefit in a national approach to tackling this problem through justice reinvestment, and there are many ways the Commonwealth can encourage and support the concept. Justice reinvestment also offers significant economic benefits to the Commonwealth, particularly through a decrease in the need for welfare services and income support. Justice reinvestment also aligns with the Commonwealth's role in promoting human rights and the aims and initiatives of closing the gap. Broad changes to Australia's justice system are not possible without the support and advocacy of the Commonwealth. We anticipate the central role of the Commonwealth would be in setting a policy landscape and securing and encouraging state and territory buy-in through mechanisms like COAG. We want to see Commonwealth leadership. As such, I am pleased the committee has recommended the Commonwealth take an active role in advocating for justice reinvestment at COAG, establishing and funding trials of justice reinvestment and promoting the establishment of an independent central coordinating body for justice reinvestment. Finally, the committee has also recommended the Commonwealth seek the establishment of justice targets for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as part of the Closing the Gap initiative. This has long been neglected, but closing the gap will not happen without reducing the imprisonment rate of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This inquiry has involved a great deal of hard work from a number of people and organisations. For this reason, I would particularly like to thank those who made submissions and those who gave evidence to the inquiry. I also wish to give my sincere thanks to the Secretariat of the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs References Committee, who have put in an immense amount of work into crafting the report. It is one of the longer reports I've had the pleasure to read on that committee, and it did indeed involve many hours of work on the part of the Secretariat and particularly Ms Christine MacDonald. I'm very pleased to be able to commend this report to the Senate.